Congratulations. You've made it through a major part of the course, and pretty much everybody is doing very well with what they've done. We've started with just in a sense, the most recognizable of elements in literature, and you've gone from there through a whole lot of more and more complex elements of literature to where you got to the point to recognize symbolism, and then you took those symbols and brought it to where you are getting into the real meaning of the story. You're analyzing pieces of literature. So, you've traversed a good deal during the course of the semester. Now, that shouldn't decrease your appreciation of literature or the fun that you have in literature. Rather, it should make it more fun, because even when you just read a story for fun, you'll be seeing more things in it. You'll be getting more into what it's really all about, and you may be doing some analyzing to say what's really happening here. So, that's terrific. You've done very, very well. I'm very pleased with the road that we've traveled up to this point. Okay, now it's time for us to move forward. We can't stay with short story the whole semester. This is Introduction to Literature, and literature involves much more than just short stories. So where we go from here is into the realm of poetry. Now, don't groan, okay? Our view toward poetry is not going to be the way you viewed poetry in the past. Too many teachers like to teach poetry as if there's a single meaning in a poem and you have to find that meaning. That doesn't make sense to me, okay? Unless you're in the same place as that poet, the same place in life, at the same time, there's no way you can know exactly what he's talking about. Poetry should be a personal experience. Okay, so we're not going to be looking at rhyme, we're not going to be looking at meter, we're not going to be looking at all those structural things in poetry. Rather, we're going to be looking at poetry as a kind of literature, a genre of literature for you to come to enjoy. Okay, a really important part in your gaining enjoyment of poetry is accepting the idea that you read poetry by the punctuation. If you read it line by line, you'll never get out of that sing-songy stuff, and it's hard to get to what it's all about. Read it the same way you read prose. So read it by the punctuation, read it by the sentences, read it by the phrases, read it by the clauses, okay? That's how you want to read poetry. Then it makes more sense. And that moves you away from, thinking about the rhyme and meter and structure and all that stuff that makes poetry difficult. And it'll move you toward getting your own ideas out of the poems, seeing what they mean to you. And you're experiencing the poem. You're seeing the poem as a real human being, okay? So that's how I want you to approach poetry, is that you're going to read it not line by line, but by the punctuation. That's what you need to do to be able to understand poetry relatively easily, okay? And we're not going to be looking for in-depth analysis of poetry. In fact, we won't ask you to analyze poems anywhere near as deeply as where you moved to when we got to the Minister's Black Veil and Young Goodman Brown. We won't be asking for that. So fear not with poetry. You'll do fine. Take the same kind of approach that you had with short stories, and you'll conquer poetry too. So, okay, primarily there are two kinds of poetry, okay? And we're going to talk about the first kind of poetry today. That's narrative poetry. Narrative poetry. You can tell from the name, it narrates. And what does that mean? It tells a story. Narrative poetry tells you a story, okay? So we're going to be looking at poems that tell stories today, okay? The other kind of poetry is lyric poetry, and that's poetry that gets into the emotions. We're not doing lyric poetry today. We're doing narrative poetry. This is where we start. This is the kind of poetry that I think is easiest for all of us to relate to, because pretty much any story we can find ways to tie into it, because we're human beings. And so stories are generally about human beings, okay? And so that's how you want to look at poetry. So I'm going to give you some examples of poetry first, out of my head here, some poems that I particularly like, and then I'll give you some other poems that are in your book. The 3 poems that I'll talk about, first of all, aren't in your book. Not that I'll talk about, but that I will recite for you. Okay. And the first one is a really well-known poem, and one of my favorites, and the name of it is Casey at the Bat. Now, you're probably not surprised that we're doing Casey at the Bat, since I am dressed in baseball garb, and we've learned that setting is an important part of, so I'm creating a setting for you. Yeah, I could have gone to a baseball diamond, but I didn't. We're on the deck in the back of my house because it's nice to be outside. Okay, so the outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2 with but 1 inning more to play. And so when Cooney died at first and Burroughs did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to the hope that springs eternal in the human breast. They thought if only Casey could get a whack at that, they'd put up even money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a pudding and the latter was a fake. So upon that stricken multitude, grim melancholy sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single, to the wonderment of all, and Blake, the much despised, tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted and they saw what had occurred, there was Jimmy safe on second, and Flynn a hugging third. Then from this gladdened multitude went up a joyous yell. It bounded from the mountain top and rattled in the dell. It struck upon the hillside and recoiled upon the flat. For Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearings and a smile on Casey's face. And when, responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the wreathing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance gleamed in Casey's eye. A sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by that sturdy batsman the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey. "Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches black with people there went up a muffled roar like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. "Kill him! Kill the umpire!" shouted someone on the stand, and it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to that pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew. But Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, "Strike 2!" "Fraud!" cried the maddened thousands, and the echo answered, "Fraud!" But a scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey would not let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lips. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball. And now he lets it go. And now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. Okay, so that was the poem Casey at the Bat, which probably all of you have heard before, but it obviously tells the story. And it's we've probably all played sports at one time or another, some kind of sports, even if it was just pick-up games in your own backyard, so you understand everything that goes into it. Okay, and so you may well be able to personally relate to that poem as well as just know what that story is all about. Okay, so Casey at the Bat is one of my favorites. Okay, another one of my favorites is The Cremation of Sam McGee, and you all know what cremation means. Okay, and that poem goes like this: there are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen clear sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Lebarge. I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home down the south to roam round the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell, though he'd often say in his homely way that he'd sooner live in hell. On a Christmas day, we were mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold through the parka's fold that stabbed like a driven nail. If our eyes we'd close, then the lashes froze, till sometimes we couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. And that very night, as we lay packed tight in our robes beneath the snow, and the dogs were fed and the stars overhead were dancing heel and toe, he turned to me and, "Cap," says he, "I'll cash in this trip, I guess. And if I do, I'm asking that you won't refuse my last request." Well, he seemed so low that I couldn't say no. Then he says with a sort of moan, "It's a cursed cold, and it's got right hold till I'm chilled clear through to the bone. Yet, 'tain't being dead, it's the awful dread of an icy grave that pains. So I want you to swear that foul or fair, you'll cremate these last remains." Well, a pale's last need is a thing to heed, and I swore I would not fail. And we started on at the streak of dawn, but God, he looked ghastly pale. He sat all day and he raved all day of his home in Tennessee, and before nightfall, a corpse was all that was left of Sam McGee. There wasn't a breath in this land of death as he hurried horror-driven, with a corpse half hid that I couldn't get rid because of a promise I'd given. It was lashed to the sleigh, and it seemed to say, "You may tax your brawn and brains, but you promised true. Now it's up to you to cremate these last remains." Well, a promise made is a debt unpaid, and the trail has its own stern cold. In the days to come, though my lips were numb and my heart, how I cursed that load. In the long, long night by the lone firelight, while the huskies round in a ring howled out their woes to the nameless foes. Oh God, how I loathed that thing. And every day the quiet clay seemed to heavy and heavier grow. But on we went, though the dogs were spent and the grub was getting low. The trail was bad, and I felt half mad, but I swore I would not give in. And I'd often sing to that hateful thing, and it hearkened with a grin. Till we came to a barge on Lake Lebarge, and a derelict there lay. It was jammed in the ice, but I thought in a trice. It was jammed in the ice, but I saw in a trice. It was called the Alice May. I looked at it, and I thought a bit. Then I looked at my frozen chum. "Then here," said I, with a sudden cry, "is my crematorium. Some planks I tore from the cabin floor, and I lit the boiler fire. Some coal I found that was lying around, and I heaped the fuel higher. The flames just soared, and the furnace roared, such a blaze you seldom see. Then I burrowed a hole in the glowing coal, and I stuffed in Sam McGee. Then I made a hike, for I didn't like to hear him sizzle so. And the heavens howled, and the huskies bawled, and the wind began to blow. I was cold as ice, but the hot sweat rolled down my cheeks, and I don't know why. And a greasy smoke and an inky cloak went streaking down the sky. I do not know how long in the snow I wrestled with grisly fear, but the stars came out and they danced about ere again I ventured near. I was sick with dread, but I bravely said, "Guess it's time I peeked inside." It's time I looked, and he's probably cooked, and the door I opened wide. And there sat Sam, looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar, and he wore a smile you could see a mile, and he said, "Please close that door. It's cold in here, but I gravely fear you'll let in the cold and storm. Since I left Plum Tree down in Tennessee, it's the first time I've been warm." There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Lebarge. I cremated Sam McGee. Okay, so that's another poem for you, The Cremation of Sam McGee. It's written by a guy named Robert Service, and it's a narrative poem. It tells a story, okay? Narrative poems tell a story. So that's what we're looking at today, this week, our narrative poems, okay? And let's see here. These two have come off the top of my head. Here's a third that I can try to give you off the top of my head. But this is one that all of you know, and I'll see how I can do on it. It's written by one Clement Moore, and it's called "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." Okay, and this is a story. This is a narrative poem, and I give you this one so you can understand very clearly that there are a lot of narrative poems out there. Okay, "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their head. And I in my kerchief and Mom in her cap had just settled down for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a sash, tore open the shutter and threw up the sash. The moon on the crest of the new fallen snow gave a luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer and a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. On Dasher, on Dancer, on Prancer, on Vixen, on Comet and Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall. Now dash away, dash away, dash away all. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I pulled in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A jumble of bag he had flown on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry, his droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his face was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a wreath. A wink of his eye and a nod of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying a finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere they went out of sight, Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Okay, so that is a narrative poem that all of you are very familiar with, okay? So I deliberately chose one like that because I wanted you to understand that narrative poems are simply poems that tell a story. And, with all poems, if we do them punctuation-wise rather than line by line, they are so much easier to understand. Now, stop me for a second and grab a pencil and paper so you can write down these poems and page numbers, okay? So just, hit pause for a minute or whatever, and then restart it. Okay, so the poems that I want you to look at this week are these. Or you can choose from, because you have to write about at least 2. You can write about more if you want to. But in your essay this week, I want you to write about narrative poetry, how it hits you, a couple of particular poems. You can choose from Casey at the Bat, The Cremation of Sam McGee, The Night Before Christmas, and any of these. Dog's Death on page 548, and a lot of you may personally be able to relate to that one, okay? Dog's Death on page 548, Nighttime Fires on page 561, Manners on page 582, Hazel Tells Laverne on page 596, The Raven on page 575, and Richard Cory on page 669. So let me repeat those for you. What happened? Get back here. Okay, let me repeat those for you. My picture just kind of flitted away, but it's back now. Let me repeat those. Besides the 3 that I recited for you, Casey at the Bat, Cremation of Sam McGee, and Night Before Christmas, there is also Dog's Death on 548, Nighttime Fires on 561, Manners 582, Hazel Tells Laverne 596, The Raven 575, and Richard Cory 669. Again, I'm not looking for you to do poetic analysis. I'm looking for you to look at these poems, see the story that they tell you, tell us the story they tell you, and tell us if there's some way that poem, any of these poems, specifically relate to you, or if they remind you of something else. Be willing to talk about that. That's the fun of all of this, okay, is making it personal. Okay? Have a good week.